Hassanal bin Noor Rashid is from Malaysia and has a master's degree in international relations from Monash University. He has written and spoken widely on various issues pertaining to international relations, geopolitics, interfaith relations, spirituality, and morality. He has the privilege of working very closely with Chandra Muzaffar and is full-time program coordinator for the International Movement for a Just World. And we have already introduced Just as that society which seeks to develop a global awareness of the injustices within the existing system with the aim of evolving an international order which will enhance human dignity and social justice.
I would like to thank, of course, the organizers for allowing me to speak on a very important, controversial, and also contentious topic about Christian Zionism. Firstly, of course, Illan, Pappe, Peacock, fantastic presentations. I enjoyed it immensely. And I want to also share about my experience. I was asked to share about my experiences as a Muslim in regards to the experiences of Christian Zionism, but I won't be specifically talking on anything really theological per se, because even though I'm of the Muslim faith, I'm of the Islamic faith, obviously I myself cannot speak on behalf of every Muslim in the world and every culture out there. But what I want to talk about is, in regards to Zionism, we all already have highlighted it about what it is, about the nature of Christian Zionism in varying degrees as a social political movement that is deeply connected with the hegemonic powers and the state of Israel, as well as the identity of the Jewish people to that extent. There's also mention about Islamophobic elements, the nature of its origin, its motivations. All that has been covered already by Illan Pappe as well, and a lot of the theological groundings of the contention as well by Peacock. But I suppose what a lot of things haven't been discussed actually is, while we understand its motives, while we understand its intent, if you will, we need to understand also about how, I suppose, it permeates into civil society, and that's the basis of my discussion today. What I will be discussing is about not just really a Muslim experience, it's more specific than that, because I will be also discussing about it as contextually a Malaysian experience. It's a very personal one, but before I begin, I want to actually give some background about it for those of us who might not be as familiar about Malaysia as a context. So Malaysia, geographically, is in Southeast Asia. China's on top, Australia's down under. We are in the center of it all with a wonderful mix of identities, historical civilization, cultures, ethnicities, and traditions in a single shared space. It shares its space with many Christians, Buddhists, Hindus, and of course Muslims, all with a shared history during its formative years of Malaysian state, especially sharing the colonial experiences. It has become a sort of what I would term as a multicultural neutral grounds of sorts, with all these groups having dealt with one another on various social, economical, and political levels. Now, picture this one where the majority of Malaysia's population are Muslims, 60% if you want to put a number to it. And as of the 2010 housing census, 9.2% of Malaysia's population identify as Christians. 60 to 70% of their numbers identify as evangelicals, which include a majority of Chinese and East Malaysian Bumiputras, or indigenous groups from East Malaysia. In terms of that number, 7 million ethnic Chinese people who live in Malaysia, 706,000 of them are considered Christians. And why am I mentioning all these things about Christians, Islam, Christians, Malays, and all these things? Because in the Malaysian context, it's important to note that religiosity is also highly interrelated with ethnicity. So typically, the stereotypes goes, the Malays are Muslims, Chinese are mostly Buddhists, Hindus are mostly Indians, and Christians take a form from Indians and the Chinese, as well as the tribal Bumiputras. That's the way that Malaysia is. Now, why does it matter? Now, I'm going to resound a quotation from someone, I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with the name of David Dimian, who is a Coptic Christian based in Canada, watchman for the Nation Missions, who focuses specifically on the Chinese evangelization. As he was once quoted saying, you can find the quotation on the National Evangelical Christian Fellowship website, where he says that Malaysia is a bridge facilitating the gospel's return to the Middle East due to the country's multicultural and multi-religious composition. In chess, as he says, even unimportant pieces must be moved to trigger the next move. And Malaysia is at the forefront of the pieces that God wants to move. If Malaysia doesn't move, the whole game comes to a standstill. Another name I want to quote is Peter Sukahira, who is a Japanese American who lives in Israel, a graduate of the Christ for the Nations Institute in Texas, who has trained many of Malaysia's own congregations and maintains a strong influence on the Malaysian evangelicism scene, where he says that Malaysia is strategic because the great Christian nation, the great Christian awakening, in the Chinese world meets the Muslim world in the same country. A growing number of Christians, mostly ethnically, emphasizing once more on the ethnicity alongside the Malay Muslims in the same nation. So it's a very important country for that reason. They were speaking mostly with two aims, which is to connect Christians to their Hebraic roots, and secondly, for Christians to fully understand God's intention to transform all society rather than just to establish a Christian religion. So all these things about identifying about the multiculturalism aspects of Malaysia. In multiculturalism, in the Malaysian experience, there is strength to be had, that is true, which is we grow together, we understand each other, it gives a sort of bedrock and foundation for mutual understanding and growth. But there is a certain weakness that is identified and exploitable. In any multicultural society, or rather, never mind any society in general, power structures exist in a fluctuating and contentious state. And the art of politics, as we all know, in the societal management depends on the successful navigation of that. Social powers in Malaysia involve typical class issues of wealth, access, and control, of mechanism of power. There's the added ethnic dimension. Ethnic dimensions gives legitimacy to leaders and elites within ethnic groups. Intercommunal policies takes a much more prominent role, and that's what they mobilize a lot of people. The stereotypes within this context are simple. The dominant Malay Muslim Bumiputras hold the power and politics and administrative authorities, whereas the Chinese are seen to be holding the wealth and control the majority of economic activities. This relationship throughout history has created, of course, obvious fissures in social relationships. Various instances of flashpoints of arguments and contention comes largely on civil issues. But the discontent born from the issues, exasperated by the feelings of discrimination, perceived bigotry from these groups who are minorities considered in Malaysia, they're all, in fact, well-known anger and frustration, and the feeling of this empowerment leads to exploitability. It's here where Christian-Zionism, as a movement, finds its foothold and increased the propensity of its advocacy in Malaysia. As quoted by various academies, there are 7 strategies employed to exploit the weakness, and some call this the 7 evangelical strategies towards Malaysia's non-Muslims. The first being is penetration of sectors of society dominated by non-Muslims, which include media, entertainment, commerce, finance, legal, all that. Evangelization of non-Muslim tribal Bumiputras, the penetration of non-Muslims into political groups, especially where they can form government, evangelization of non-Muslim youth, and evangelization of the marginalized groups, and the promotion of the above within the context of an appeal to human rights and universal morality, with the implication that the basis of such are Christian values rather than Islamic ones. And of course, finally, the 7th, which is the Zionization of key ethnic minorities as chosen people, with a special connection to contemporary and historical Israel. We can see how this plays out next. Quoting from another one, George Anodare, Singapore President of Shalom Israel of Singapore, who equates the Jewish experience as stated in the Bible and in the European historical context with that of the Chinese victims as they perceive it, or as it's been told to them. Anodari's specialization is contextualizing Christian Zionism for Southeast Asia's Chinese minority with this central theme of relating them to the persecution of the Jews. This relationship is first emphasized by the saying that the Chinese are wired like the Jews and able to create wealth out of nothing, giving economic sways over the country they live in. Now, The merits of these claims and the attributes are debatable. And of course, yes, to some points, no to some points, but it's more complicated in the nuances of these things. But the point here isn't about the qualities that's being mentioned, it's what idea is being nurtured from this, and ultimately who is doing this and who benefits. Because at the end of the day, the idea here is actually to shift perception. Perception is power. Perception can lead to action. Action shapes reality. Therefore, perception is the reality of it. Feeding on the perceived persecution within the Malaysian Chinese group's experience, I can quote again from David Damien, who says that when he informs his audience on his conversation with God, he says, I have prepared a people, a remnant of my body who have no fear of persecution or death. It is the Chinese people, and they will have a very special role to play in seeing the end time destiny of the Jews and Arabs being released. Contextualizing it further, evangelics continue to contextualize Chinese history and culture in an attempt to deepen Christian traditions, relationship with Chinese roots, alleging even Hebrew roots of Chinese culture. One such effort has been done to this is actually in Yuan Zimin's Lao Tzu and the Bible. That's the title of the book, where it is claimed that in a preface by Paul de Vries that Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching paved the way for the gospel, preparing the heart and mind for the Christ in ways similar to the writing of the Hebrew prophet Isaiah and some of the other Hebrew prophets. This appeal towards the sentiments of the Christians in Malaysia, especially the Chinese Christians, exploits the existing fissures within Malaysia's social structures, exploiting perceived discrimination and struggles in order to encourage a movement that works actively and antagonistically against the existing power structures that are perceived as oppressive and of evil. It creates a very insular group with its own set of internally generated morals and motivations, with its own, but especially, even though it's so insular, it has a very large network, a very incredible network with all the resources to actually help it mobilize and actualize its agendas. And this is part of how Christian-Zionism strategizes their influence and actions in many societies, especially in Malaysia. And it's not just the Chinese, as I mentioned just now, it's also the tribal Bumiputras on the east of Malaysia, conveying the ideas of biblical ownership in the context of Malaysia's tribal Bumiputras as God's gatekeepers. A quote again, during the Gemburu Besar Raban Kristan Jaku Iban, said by David Damien again, in December of 2013, the native people are the gatekeepers. As the people rise up to take their place, they begin to stretch their arms, all the people groups the Lord has brought in the land. Appealing to all these perceptions and exploiting the underlying statements, to sum it all up, I can give a quote where he says, in the beginning, he saw the first people, the natives. He saw the enemy and what the enemy has done, and he said no more. The enemy will not have the final word. These are the kinds of words that are being used to mobilize, to encourage, to basically flame up certain sentiments among the people. Now, the words empower, linking them biblically to the plight of the persecuted in the Bible, this is the relationship that is attempted to be formed. And this is how Christian Zionism movement works in Malaysia and towards the greater goal of total dominionism in Malaysia itself. Now, I have spoken a lot about what the Christian Zionists and how they do it and the words that they use and the methods upon which they try to infiltrate within society. But while the strides are being made by Christian Zionists, many of what has been presented here is my own analysis, of course, based on the investigation and findings of more dedicated analysts. But the problem here is evident. What are the Muslims themselves saying about this? The proverbial academic ivory tower has painstakingly discussed and analyzed matters pertaining to this issue. What does it mean for Muslim groups in Malaysia? What have they said about it? What are the feelings about it? Especially given that this element is supposedly so insidious that it threatens the existential stability of Malaysia. But what is the discussion? And honestly, the short answer is actually there's not much of a discussion. More accurately about Christian Zionism, the discussions that we've always had in Malaysia, to me at least, is almost non-holistic, if anything, almost non-existent. And I'll try to unpack this in this part of my discussion, which is again, going back to that idea that Malaysia, the concept of religious identity is deeply linked with ethnicities. For a country with such a mixture of faith traditions, interfaith discourse is arguably quite tepid. Part of it has to do with the issue of religion and politics as a discussion in itself, leading to unease and leading to feelings of unease and possible friction. Now, there is a logic for that, to mind you. There is a real good logic for that, which is because Malaysia has had an experience with ethnic tempers being boiled over to some degree of overt conflict. I'm citing, of course, those who know Malaysian history on the 13th May 1969 issue. Which is why when we talk about religiosity, even when I'm remembering what Peacock says, that we need to actually bring forward more of the discussions. But in Malaysia itself, this is a challenge here because we view these kind of discussions with a certain degree of taboo. Malaysia's history means that they abhor violence, so we tend to skirt around the issue, never really in public discourse, mostly just private. And those that do try to discuss interfaith matters also tend to be mainly focused, yes, really more on the theological issues of faith, as important, but rarely discussing about the geopolitical complexities of faith group movements. And as mentioned about ethnic groups and their religious identities are highly correlated with a lot of communal issues getting lumped up into it. Even those who try to engage with those discussions ultimately gives away to posturing. I've had personal experiences when we try to discuss issues of religiosity, spirituality, and politics. They simply just walk away. They will not engage in the discussion. Typical reasons given are because, for example, I had one where one said that you are not of the same faith group. You do not you have not lived my faith, and therefore you will not be able to understand it. And all these things, these notions give a death blow really to a lot of meaningful discussions that could have been had because of presumed complexity, personal experiences, all these things. So what this leads to in Malaysia as social discourse goes, Christian problems become their own problems. Muslim problems are their own problems. Both claim to not understand the other, while stating the other will not understand them because they are not of the same faith group. So there's the conundrum here. The Muslims community here also contribute this in their own way, especially those who are at the leader of power. It only takes a very general viewing of Muslim groups in Malaysia. And a lot of popular and political figures who essentially, I would say, they pit Christian and Muslim groups together for political mileage. And this is all expressly done at the expense of even the Palestinian cause, whether it's the Palestinian cause, the Rohingya issues, all these. These becomes nothing more than just platforms of self-promotion to play with certain popular sentiments of the Malay Muslim groups. And the same strategy is used on the other side, which observe these things, and they actually mention that these are all attempts at Islamification of all aspects of life when it comes to the Christian groups in Malaysia. So Islamism has a lot to do with fear-mongering, and again, that kills a lot of further discussions and discourses. There are the two barriers within Malaysia that removes the possibility of meaningful discourse. We already have discussed the third barrier, which is the Christian-Zionist movements, and they do flare up stereotypes, linking and equating it to biblical context. And with Muslims also not making much of an attempt, reacting to various degrees of antagonism and hostility. The action of each of these groups simply confirm their sentiments, and the result is just animosity reigns and the gulf even widens on the relationships. So, to not take up any more time, I just want to conclude by saying that, as previously mentioned by Illan, Pappe, and Peacock, Christian Zionism's immensity as a network is matched only by its commitment and intent. It serves at the behest of the State of Israel and continues to do so at the cost of Palestinians' history, identity, and lives, because ultimately it is about that. A strategy to permeate every aspect of social life through which it indicates a driving purpose behind this movement. It seeks to stop any discussion. So while we are talking about promoting discussion, they are actively attempting to stop discussions by denying criticisms, just allowing the discussion to take place. It doesn't ultimately, it removes any chance of reconciliation and genuine introspection of our faith. And it doesn't allow faith to grow, to evolve. And that is my experience as a Muslim. It is an experience done to me of what I know about Christian Zionism and its effects within Malaysian society. It still remains highly academic to an extent. In my personal view, when we talk about the nuances of it, with any layman discussion of the matter being muddled in communal, religious, and political issues. But at the end of the day, we must continue talking about it. We must continue taking a vigilant stand about the matter of Christian Zionism, especially the plight and the threat it actually brings not just to Christian-Muslim relations, but to civil society in general, against those that seek to encourage and exploit divisive differences and strive to maintain order among the discussion table. It is imperative that we continuously try to maintain discussion. It will be uncomfortable and extremely awkward. And a lot of times when we want to negotiate and reconcile with our faith differences, with our spiritual differences, and also in Malaysia's case, in our communal differences. But it is what brings about mutual understanding. That's how it's done. To me, countering Christian Zionism is ultimately, if I were to dare say so, countering terrorism in a sense. There's a lot of painful and awkward issues that need to be discussed, but the discussions must be made. Otherwise, the sentiments over here will be bred, exploited, and further incited by those with those nefarious inclinations. In Malaysia, we have a long tradition in caring and worrying about the feelings and sentiments of others, good qualities. Shows that we actually have a lot of empathy about things. But we avoid a lot of discussions that do need to be discussed. So while we are, to an extent, I would say, very nice people, we are actually failing to be kind if we let things keep going the way it is. So to talk about this, to bring this issue to light, that is a different kind of kindness that I think we need to see more encouraged. But this is the fanciful dreams of me as an individual, held by my own hope, born by my own principles. So I think I'll end my discussion over there, and if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. So thank you very much for listening to me.